What's up guys, Chris here from Mainely Mesh. Today we're going to talk about breaking in your pocket. In this video I'm going to go into a few things different than just pounding it in. We're going to talk about which meshes require a little bit more break-in or should be broken in a little bit more versus those that maybe you might want to avoid breaking it in as deep as possible. And I'm also going to address tensioning your pocket a little bit to avoid stress on the actual head itself. Please keep in mind through the course of this video that my biases here come from my background in stringing thousands of sticks at a time for kind of mass production runs for companies versus just trying to string the perfect pocket for myself. So in theory, the perfect pocket, you would have the perfect break-in. You're really trying to dial it in for just the one stick that you are using. Whereas for my background, I can't afford to take an extra 10 to 15 minutes to really dial that in, or the 30 minutes it would take to pound it in, restring the same sidewall, etc., etc. So this is more kind of a conservative approach to pounding in your pocket. And I just want to put that up front for you guys. Starting with the latter of those two topics. One of my big personal pet peeves is over tensioning your mesh when you're stringing it. If you take a look at this pocket right now, you can see there's a decent amount of tension right here on this fourth knot that I've pulled down. If I went crazy and pulled that down one sidewall hole even further, at that point, you would notice the head starting to flare ever so slightly. With the stiffer construction of heads these days, you don't notice it as much as you might have in the old days with it was like a Brian Truth that was like a noodle. I'm trying to think of some other heads that flared pretty easily. The original Optic did a little bit. The point I'm trying to make though is that extra tensioning will actually warp your head more over time than any sort of wear and tear in the short term. And it makes sense. If I am providing a constant pressure on a head, right, the strings never come off, okay? So no, I'm not bending the head like crazy as I would in a check, but I'm providing constant pressure over time, and that's gonna permanently warp your head. So yes, it can be fun to pull as much tension into the pocket as possible, flex those biceps as you're pulling, use pliers or whatever to make sure you get that every last ounce of tension. But just be wary that sometimes that may actually lead to you damaging your underlying head. That doesn't mean that you don't want to push the limits a little bit on the tension though. What you'll find is that if you have a raw piece of mesh as you're putting it in, there might be a place, such as this one, where it looks like I'm providing a good amount of tension, and I'm just going to want to stretch out that mesh a little bit more as I'm stringing the pocket using my thumbs here like this. Okay, and then I'm reducing the tension on the underlying head while still having a pocket that's going to perform well after it's gotten a ton of reps and the mesh is settled a little bit more. As far as taking a baseball bat or a stick with a ball on the end and really pounding this thing in, there's one thing you want to keep in mind, which is the actual construction of your mesh. In my last video, we talked about kind of deader meshes versus springier meshes with like the Hero 3 memory mesh, memory mesh on one end on the dead side, the String Kings of the world, really just String King on this other side, and in the middle having like Frontier mesh, Thrown Fiber, what were the other ones I included? Stringer Shack right in the middle. I also said that String King has the most complicated construction because of their Twist-Tex technology. For this middle spectrum and on the dead end of things, so anything from Stringer Shack to Hero, could definitely recommend pounding it in a little bit more. The reason being those have a little bit more simplistic construction that's gonna settle over time, might bag out a little bit, but we'll be nice in calling it settling because it's not really bagging per se. There's no complicated spring construction to it with Twist-Tex or anything. So for those, it's actually okay to really pound it in, get that maximum depth, and then string in your pocket the way you want it to be strung. For a mesh like String King, they definitely recommend pounding it in a lot. So I will say that. The one thing you got to keep in mind though is there is a springiness to it, right? And just as with springs, there's a spring coefficient, which means you can max out that spring coefficient. If you love the springy feel of String King and you pound it out as much as possible, the deeper you get it, the more you stretch it out and push it to that max width, you're actually reducing the springiness of the mesh. So once again, there's this fine line based on preference, right? If I want the maximum springiness, I might kind of get it settled into a nice shape, push it out a little bit, but not really try to max out the depth of my pocket. Whereas, let's say I like the feel of the roughness of String King's construction, but the springiness doesn't matter to me as much, then I'm gonna really pound for maximum depth and then make sure that that's my settled pocket that's gonna be consistent over time. I think the biggest misconception with pounding in your pocket is that if you don't pound in your pocket all the way, it's not going to be as consistent as possible. This isn't necessarily true. You can provide more force when pounding in a pocket on a baseball bat or whatever than your pocket will experience during a shooting motion. What I mean by that is I can use my stick a ton and it might not achieve the same depth that it would if I really cranked it while pounding in the pocket. It's a subtle difference, but the point being is that there's actually a lot you can do manually with stretching it out with your hands and stuff that will get it to the same consistency level as any maximally pounded in pocket. The last thing I need to address is legality. Once again, my bias, especially during more legitimate games like high school, collegiate, games that counted, is that I never want to be called for a stick penalty. It's so frustrating as a coach, as a teammate, if I have a buddy who's out there and then all of a sudden he gets a 3-minute non-releasable penalty, although I think pocket depth is 1 minute. Can't remember. It's still infuriating. So I have always tended on the side of caution. I can get my pockets to do and perform the way I want them to with a ton of hold without it being, right on that line. While I say that, nowadays I am out of those more legitimate games, right? I play box mostly, which doesn't have those same regulations. And any field lacrosse I'm playing is men's league stuff, so they're not checking me as much, if at all. Want to have a fun time? Ask a men's league ref to do a stick check. That's an eye roll. So yeah, I pound out my pockets a little bit more and I'm kind of developing a newer style that I didn't have before. But that's also just because I have more free time on my hands. There are two main ways to break in your stick. There's A, using tools, and B, not using tools. Starting with the not using tools, basically what I do for most of my sticks, you can form a fist, punch it out a little bit, or more importantly for me, is trying to define my proper channel. So I'm gonna take 2 thumbs and kind of rub it along the inside of the channel, bag it out in that midsection without paying too much attention to the outer edges. The reason I want to avoid these outer edges is because I want them to maintain their tension. If I pound out these outer edges, what I'm probably going to have to do is restring that sidewall as they loosen up. You're going to have a little bit less tension up here, which means you can probably pull a little bit more length, but we want these outer edges to have a little bit more tension because that's where our channel comes from, that's where our consistency and our hold comes from as well. So I almost never pound out my outer edges of the pocket, which isn't what a lot of people tell you to do. But a lot of my break-in work is really just done manually. But the amount of effort you need to put in also slightly varies based on your stringing style. So if I'm stringing on top of the sidewalls here, most meshes are wide enough that they'll get you right about the legal limit depth-wise. Now if I'm stringing to the inside, as I do here, that actually is going to bring the mesh a little bit lower, meaning the pocket is going to be a bit more shallow if you don't pound it out, right? Because I've set that mesh lower. At this point, I do need to pound out this pocket a little bit more to have the same amount of depth that a normal pocket would. So part of why you've seen all these break-in tutorials is because people are starting to string to the inside even more, and you are going to want to get a little bit more depth in that actual pocket. All in all, this is probably a longer video than you would expect, but what I'm saying is you can get away with less pocket break-in than you might think, especially depending on what type of mesh you're using. I might spend 60 seconds tops depending on my stringing style. If I'm stringing a normal pocket strung on the outside, probably spending 60 seconds with it. With strung to the inside, I might spend 3 minutes pounding it in just to make sure I get that depth. But that's about it. I've probably opened up a whole can of worms and I'm gonna get a lot of comments on this, but as always, I will try to respond to them as they come in. Thanks so much. If you guys have any questions, always comment down below. I know I'm repeating what I just said, but I'll catch you guys next time.